Welcome back to Beyond the Bench, the podcast from Mountain States Legal Foundation, where we explore the cases, people, and principles shaping the fight for liberty in America. Today, we are joined by Nadine Strossen, American constitutional law scholar, civil liberties advocate, and free speech expert, best known for serving as president of the American Civil Liberties Union, also known as ACLU. She was the first woman to lead the ACLU and remains one of the organization's longest serving presidents. She's also a longtime professor at New York Law School, where she taught constitutional law, civil liberties, and human rights. Now, she serves as a senior fellow with FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. Nadine, it is great to have you, and thanks for joining us for a conversation.
I really look forward to it, Noah. Thank you for inviting me.
So I kind of want to just jump right into it, and I think just dive into who you are as well as what you've done, and I guess just to keep it a little bit more abstract on the outside of the tunnel. When did you first know you wanted to get more involved in the First Amendment?
As soon as I heard about the First Amendment, I had seriously, Noah, as far back as I can remember, even as a child who had never heard of the Constitution or the legal system, I had an innate desire to express myself freely and to listen to other people and to defend their right to express themselves freely. So when I became a little bit older and learned that there actually is a tool that can potentially be enforced to secure those rights, and that I could go to law school and work to make that legal tool into a reality in real cases, I seized the opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just saw recently that, you've always kind of defended civil liberties and just the well-rounding of the Constitution throughout your career. And then it wasn't really, I think, until the last, I believe you said 10 years that you really jumped like and made it your focus of the First Amendment. So what kind of made that shift and what drew you to dedicating more time and more quality towards the First Amendment?
Thank you so much. That's a really important clarification. Yes, I have defended free speech since even long before I heard of the First Amendment, but as part of a broader human rights and civil liberties agenda, to which I am still completely committed. The ACLU defends all fundamental freedoms for all people. We firmly believe, and I think that the Constitution reflects the belief, kind of an Enlightenment liberal, classical liberalism, that no matter who you are, no matter what you believe, you are entitled to certain fundamental freedoms just by virtue of your humanity. But while those rights may exist in theory, they are under attack in the real world every day. And certainly throughout my ACLU presidency until fairly recently, I was regularly speaking and advocating on behalf of a whole host of rights, everything from equal protection, non-discrimination, privacy, fundamental fairness, due process, and so forth. But starting about a dozen years ago, I started to see, and others have now chimed in and said they were noticing this at about the same time, about a dozen years ago, that there were growing pressures of illiberalism, again, rejection of the classic Enlightenment values of freedom of speech and freedom of thought and freedom of inquiry, that these growing pressures were mounting from both ends of the political spectrum. And because I have experienced throughout my long lifetime of crusading for all human rights and civil liberties, that the most fundamental tool for advancing those rights is free speech, and that the most effective way to suppress any rights is through censorship. I decided to concentrate my efforts fully on the cluster of rights, including academic freedom, free speech, free thought, open discourse, civil discourse, open inquiry, and so forth. And that continues to be a more than full-time job.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love how you kind of touched on how it's evolved and how your origins have always kind of been around just civil liberties. And I want to kind of stay around there before we expand further into your illustrious and long career. But if college age Nadine could see your career now, what would shock her the most?
Well, first of all, I would be I'm shocked sounds like a negative term. I would be absolutely thrilled, beyond my imagining. I never had the dream of being the head of the largest and oldest civil liberties organization in the country and therefore in the world. I never could have imagined that I could have earned a living by devoting my knowledge and my skills to uh, issues with which I am so passionately engaged. So I get to do well in terms of, supporting myself and loved ones economically, but also to do good according to my deepest conceptions of what is good for individuals and society. That is just such a dream come true. I mean, and it wasn't even a dream. I wasn't arrogant enough to think that I could aspire to have such a great opportunity. That said, it's what I wish for every single one of my law students, that they will be able to use, and the other students that I meet who are studying in other fields, that they will be able to use their education, their experience, everything they have to bring with themselves as human beings and as educated people, not only to provide a comfortable and healthy life for themselves and their loved ones, but also to really feel that they are making a difference in a way that matters. And I have recently read that studies of happiness, which was a field that didn't even exist when I was a student, but now it's a respected field, that apparently all human beings do have a yearning to have a life of purpose more than getting beyond our most basic physical needs. But so that's really wonderful. What would be shocking on the negative end, I suppose, the extent to which the same issues have to be fought and defended over and over and over again. I'm not sure I quite realized that at a younger age. That said, the principal founder of the ACLU, a man named Roger Baldwin, who founded the organization more than 100 years ago, famously said, "No fight for civil liberties ever stays won." And we know, as I, as an educator, know that each generation has to become familiar with constitutional principles and Enlightenment principles. And it's not something that one can take for granted that even the knowledge exists, let alone the commitment to them. So, but I think I would not have realized in some sense how repetitive it would be. But not to sound complaining, anybody who's interested, I'm always happy to repeat information and hopefully inspiration about our liberties and rights.
Absolutely, and I like how you touched on how every single generation can kind of have its own medium of civil liberties violations, civil liberties battles, and doing some research. You've stated that your passion for individual freedom has its origins in the stories you heard as a child. So, like I read that your grandfather and his stories of Yugoslavia in World War I, and your father being in Nazi Germany during World War II. How did those kind of stories shape your understanding of liberty and dissent?
So on both sides of my family, I'm probably a typical American in this sense. Um, there was experience of oppression of various sorts. The most blatant brutality in my father's case, based on his identity as a so-called half Jew, born in what also in Germany, and what ultimately became Nazi Germany, where he was sentenced to hard labor, slave labor that was designed to kill the prisoners slowly. I mean, if they were young and healthy enough, they weren't gassed to death, they were worked to death. And he was punished in that horrible way just because of who he was, and also because of what he believed, even as a teenager. He was very active in anti-Hitler movements, and that was a part of his reason for his punishment as well. On my mother's side, my grandfather was not only an economic refugee from severe poverty in what is now Croatia, but was also was a dissident from the prevailing political and religious doctrine in the old country, and then ironically comes to this country. He was a Marxist, very much a person of the left, advocating what we would now call democratic socialism. And he was a pacifist. He strongly opposed United States involvement in World War I. And that was a crime throughout the United States at that time. That is a major reason why the ACLU was founded at exactly that time, to try to translate the paper promises of the First Amendment, that you have the right to freedom of expression, including to criticize government policies. But it was never actually enforced. More than 15,000 people were sentenced and imprisoned during the World War I era merely for peacefully expressing opposition to the war. Now, my grandfather was not imprisoned, but a very ingenious and cruel sentence was imposed upon him by the judge in Hudson County, New Jersey. He was forced to stand outside the courthouse, facing the courthouse with his hands and feet splayed against the wall, demonstrating his back so that passersby could spit on him and show their contempt for his views. So I certainly have family histories of people being denied the full and equal rights, both because of what they believed and because of who they were, violating the most fundamental precepts of liberty and justice for all, to which our nation aspires. And, obviously we've never actually achieved that ideal, but over the course of history, we have come closer and closer to it.
Yeah, so it sounds like fighting for liberty is just kind of in your blood. It's just passed down from generation to generation. Don't just follow what you're told. And I love to hear that. And it eventually kind of led you to the ACLU, which you then led through major cultural and political shifts, different administrations. So I guess in light of that, do you think there's any misconceptions when it comes to free speech in a whole holistic way?
Yes. In fact, my most recent book about free speech, which I co-authored with a friend and colleague, Greg Lukianoff, who is the CEO and president of FIRE, because Greg and I are both constantly advocating, speaking about free speech, and we keep encountering misconceptions, very, very common, widespread, pervasive misconceptions, which in our view go a long way toward explaining why people who say they don't support free speech say that, because they have a wrong-headed idea of what it is. And our book is actually entitled The War on Words is the main title. The subtitle is 10 Arguments Against Free Speech and Why They Fail. I would say, Noah, the strongest misconception is that from people who criticize America's strong protection of free speech, is that it is ridiculously absolutist and, does not tolerate any exceptions or any limits at all. I can't tell you how often I have heard in a disparaging way myself or the ACLU or FIRE or the United States Supreme Court, which strongly protects free speech all across the ideological spectrum of justice, that all of us are denounced as free speech absolutists. You believe that speech is absolutely always protected. Nothing could be further from the truth. First Amendment law, when you get into the weeds, is very complex, but the broad picture, the overall pattern is very simple and squares with common sense. The law does allow government to punish the speech that is, in fact, the most dangerous and the most harmful. At the same time, First Amendment law prohibits government from imposing the restrictions on speech that are the most dangerous and the most harmful. So if I could expand on that just a little bit, First Amendment law, I'm just focusing on the free speech clause of the First Amendment, which has many other important provisions as well. Those of us who teach it in law school spend an entire semester on the details of the doctrine, but I can really sum it up very, very well in two broad principles that illustrate the pattern that I just laid out. So let me start with the speech restrictions that are the most dangerous. The Supreme Court has described this by using the term viewpoint neutrality. Government must remain neutral with respect to the viewpoint, the idea, the content, or the message of the speech, no matter how unpopular that message is, no matter how hated it is, no matter how hateful or if otherwise offensive it might be. That viewpoint or content alone is never enough to justify censorship by the government. You disagree with it, then ignore it, refute it, answer it back, use whatever strategy is appropriate in the particular situation. But don't ask the government to pick and choose which ideas are disfavored. That is for we the people, to quote the opening words of the Constitution. Now, the complementary principle about the speech that is the most harmful is often referred to as the emergency principle. And that is when you get beyond the content or the message of the speech and you look at it in its overall context. If in all of the facts and circumstances, the speech either directly causes or imminently threatens certain specific serious harm, such as instigating violence or intimidating or threatening an individual, then not only can the government restrict that speech, but it should do so. Because if somebody is threatening you through their words or they're intentionally inciting imminent violence, which is likely to happen imminently, that is going to violate the rights of other people, the people who are targeted, not to mention violating their free speech rights. So, in not quite a soundbite, but I think very briefly, that common sense description and understanding of what the First Amendment does disabuses a lot of people of this inflated notion that those of us who defend it will defend every single expression and deny that speech can be harmful. Nothing is further from the truth.
And I love how you said, there's a strategy to it, right? Even if there's an ability to, like you said, refute it, ignore it, and I think a lot of those kind of tactics of also just understanding first before you immediately just rebuttal and without understanding what the actual argument is at hand.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, I think you learn that a lot being in those positions of leadership, and I kind of want to ask you what leadership lesson can only be learned when you're being criticized from all sides, or when you're talking to ideological opponents, it's people that may be on the opposite side of what you're trying to argue for.
I have had such great experiences, both personally and professionally, in terms of successfully advocating for civil liberties by collaborating, even or indeed especially, with people with whom I strongly disagree on particular issues. The ACLU famously will, first of all, defend rights for anybody, even if the right is the freedom of speech to convey a message that is completely antithetical to our own civil liberties principles. In other words, we are operating by what many of us call the free speech golden rule. If you want to have freedom for the speech that you love, then you must defend it for the speech that you loathe, because the very same principle that would allow unpopular speech to be censored because of disapproval of its viewpoint. In one place, depending on the politics at that time and place, it may be a message that you despise, but the politics change, or in a different part of the country that has a different political lineup, it's going to be the opposite kind of message and the opposite kind of speaker that is subject to censorship. Together with that, and experience demonstrates that over and over and over again. I can give you a recent example. The ACLU a couple of years ago won a very important First Amendment free speech case in the United States Supreme Court. We won 9-0, by the way. Our client was the National Rifle Association, the NRA. Most, I dare say, at least most of the outspoken ACLU members are not NRA members, do not support the NRA. To the contrary, we got so much pushback from our members. How can you defend free speech for this organization that is advocating against what we believe to be sound public policy on gun control? And, again, we had to point out it's the underlying principle. And sure enough, the First Amendment free speech principles that the ACLU won in the Supreme Court 2 years ago, where the NRA was the immediate beneficiary, that precedent has been the major precedent that has been used by universities, by civil society organizations, by law firms, by agencies, everybody that has been targeted by the Trump administration for defunding or various retaliatory measures. The major precedent that is cited against those repressive government tactics come from the NRA case. So it is strategically wise, as well as consistent with free speech principles, to defend freedom, as was famously put in a biography about the Enlightenment philosopher Voltaire. I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. And I
It's
should say, Noah, on a personal level, it's just been wonderful for me to get to know people despite strong disagreements on particular issues. It just broadens my realm of knowledge and interaction. The Mountain States Legal Foundation and the ACLU, I'm sure, are on different sides of particular issues and have quite distinct agendas, but it's been wonderful for me to collaborate with your or important organization on issues that we agree with, or whether or not we agree, that we think are important and worth discussing, such as the free speech conversation we're having now.
Absolutely. And I can say from our side, we have had a wonderful time collaborating with you as well. So we appreciate you extending that hand for help. And I think it's extremely important now more than ever to understand that, be kind to each, not even be not be completely, loving, even if you loathe against their opinion, but to be understanding towards somebody else's argument and allow them to get off their argument. It's extremely important, especially in the age of social media. That could be extremely hard for some people, and extremely easy when you're behind a screen, right? And that adds a whole
And
nother
don't
medium.
You were so wise a few minutes ago when you said, and listen to the other person and give them the benefit of the doubt. Don't presume, A, that they're wrong, or worse yet, that they're evil. Too often these days, we see that if somebody disagrees with you, you immediately assume not only that they're making a mistake, but they're committing a sin. And often, when you are willing to engage person to person, you can see that they share exactly the same goals as you. They just have a different analysis about the best way to arrive at those goals. And through we can enlighten each other and hopefully jointly make progress toward broadly shared goals.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm sure that throughout your career you found yourself in front of a lot of hot cases, like you said, even the one with the NRA where you're dealing with people who might not even have the same ideologies and other amendments that people at your organization may agree with. But I'm curious, was there a single most surreal interaction that you've had because of your role at ACLU?
A single, what was the adjective? I'm sorry.
Single most surreal interaction. So kind of something,
Surreal.
yeah.
Um, I had fairly early on in my ACLU presidency, I can slate it exactly. It must have been 1991, the year that I became president, because that was the 200th anniversary of the ratification of the Bill of Rights, ratified in 1791, including the First Amendment. And I remember having this amazing day. It may have been even December 15th, which is the exact anniversary. I started the day in Texas where I, the day before, had done a debate about, I think, about the death penalty and criminal justice issues. These were in the days when I was discussing the entire human rights, civil liberties agenda, and I did a debate somewhere near Dallas. I did a debate in Fort Worth. And then I was driven the next morning to Dallas. And this was the first time I had ever been in Dallas. And it was so surreal to drive past the school book depository from which Lee Harvey Oswald murdered John F. Kennedy, an extremely traumatic event during my childhood. And so it's really that in itself would have been surreal enough. But I then went on to my event in Dallas, which was to do a debate about abortion. The Supreme Court was then about to reconsider Roe versus Wade, and there was which had, of course, upheld the constitutional right to an abortion in 1973, but there were persistent efforts to overturn it. And it seemed with the, somewhat new justices hostile to abortion that there was a good chance that the decision would be overturned. I was arguing in favor of it. And during the question and answer period, a woman stood up in the audience and said, hello, Professor Strossen. My name is Norma McCorvey. And I'm still getting chills because most people don't know it, but she was the Roe in Roe versus Wade. She had been anonymous. So, to go from the school book depository to meeting Norma McCorvey, the Roe in the case, and that's not the end of it. I then flew back to New York, which was having a big ceremony at Columbia University to honor specifically the 200th anniversary of the First Amendment. And they had a surprise. As I was entering the venue, I noticed a lot of helicopters overhead and extra security measures. And I thought, what's going on? And then it turned out, as a total surprise, Salman Rushdie, who had then been in hiding since 1989 because of the threat on his life for writing satanic verses, he was making his first public appearance and obviously taking great personal risk because there was a bounty on his head. As we all know, he ultimately did get very, very brutally attacked just a few years ago. But so that was what a day that was, and bringing together personal heroes who had stood up for human rights from my perspective. In Kennedy's case, a great fighter for civil rights, getting slain for those views in part. Who knows exactly what the motivations were? So yeah,
Wow, what a
what
24
a day.
hours. Yeah. I could say every day's a spectrum at work, and that is definitely on the oh my gosh side, you know? And I guess talking about even the other side, is there a case or a controversy that kind of kept you awake at night in your ACLU, one that you just couldn't you were working through, or it just took many, many days, or you're like, how can I win this, or what is the angle that I
I
need?
felt that way. Again, this goes back to this is to the mid 90s when the internet was new to the public and to media and to politicians. Of course, scientists had known about it for a while, but when it burst on the public and political and media radar screen, it was greeted the way all new powerful communications media have been greeted throughout history, with suspicion and fear and attempts to censor it. And the ACLU immediately sprang into action to, I mean, first we lobbied against what ultimately passed Congress by overwhelming majorities on both sides of the aisle. It was called the Communications Decency Act, and it would have relegated the internet to the very same low level of free speech protection that exists for the over-the-air broadcast media, which are so stringent that I can't even quote certain Supreme Court opinions when I'm doing over-the-air TV and radio interviews, because you're not allowed to use certain four-letter words. And the government was arguing that that should be the standard for the internet. Now, if you can just imagine how different the internet would have been, all of the treasures and resources of information, including information about sexuality and gender and art and other materials that certain people see as indecent or offensive. Those were the terms to describe speech that would have been outlawed under this law. Almost nobody in Congress voted against it. And President Bill Clinton, Democrat, signed it. His Attorney General, Janet Reno, defended it in the Supreme Court. And here we have these 9 elderly justices who weren't familiar with the internet at all. We really, really feared that the promise of this new medium to make, unparalleled amounts of information and communication available around the world to everybody, that it would be shut down in its infancy. And so I can't tell you how extremely nervous I was about that. But I'm very, very happy to say that in a 9-0 opinion decision, the Supreme Court, in a case called Reno, Janet Reno, Bill Clinton's Attorney General versus ACLU, the Supreme Court said that the internet is entitled to the same high level of free speech protection as the traditional print medium, not going to be relegated to second-class free speech status as the broadcast media are. That said, Noah, this brings me back to your question about shock. Would I be shocked about how often the battles have to be fought over and over again? Because the ACLU versus Reno was decided in 1997. 2 years ago in 2024, so about a generation later, a quarter century later, the Supreme Court issued a decision which did not overtly or explicitly overturn Reno versus ACLU, but has very sharply narrowed it in the context of age verification requirements for minors accessing certain websites. So that's a very sobering. I was so relieved at the time. And by the way, since then, the Supreme Court, since the Reno decision in 1997, the Supreme Court consistently has strongly protected online speech. But 2 years ago, this was a turnaround. So our work is not done. No fight for civil liberties ever stays won, as Roger Baldwin well said.
Absolutely, and I've read a lot about how you made special efforts to engage diverse audiences, right, and open up what the First Amendment could sound like, could be debated on, and also welcoming opportunities to discuss civil liberty issues with people with whom you have strong disagreements with. So, what's one debate you walked into that you walked out completely rethinking with a new perspective?
Completely rethinking is too strong a word for my change of ideas. I would say more refinement and revision than a complete turnaround when it comes to uh, civil liberties principles. But I can tell you a factual matter that has legal significance where I completely changed my view. And I was thinking about that when you were talking about listening to people and, not just immediately denouncing them. So when talking about hate speech, and I put that in quotes because it's a completely subjective, vague term that people use for whatever speech they hate, and I've strongly opposed censoring is hate speech based on its viewpoint. And as I've explained, more importantly, the Supreme Court opposes that. But I have always described certain organizations as being hate groups and engaging in hate speech. And one whose case went to the Supreme Court a few years ago in the ACLU correctly supported their free speech rights, as did the Supreme Court, what is called the Westboro Baptist Church. This is a church that's family-based. Its founder, a couple generations ago, a guy named Fred Phelps, lived in Topeka, Kansas, and that's where the church was based. But they would travel all over the country demonstrating against, and with a trigger warning or apology to viewers. I'm going to quote their slogan and their website, which is www.godhatesfags.org. That was all one word. And they would demonstrate not only against LGBTQ people, but also Catholics and Jews and various racial and religious minorities, basically anybody who wasn't a member of their church. They famously or infamously would have demonstrations outside the funerals of slain members of the military while we were engaged in our military adventures in Iraq and Afghanistan, and saying really ugly things about the soldiers because they thought that the U.S. military was not discriminating enough against gay people. Strange at a time when the military didn't even allow you in if you described yourself as gay. Be that as it may, Megan Phelps Roper, who was born into this church and grew up in it, was raised to participate in those demonstrations from the time she was a young child. To make a long story short, she was recruited by her family to go online at a time when she was very adept at Twitter, as it then was, and the older folks were not so familiar with it, to recruit younger people. And what happened was that rather she got into engagements with an Orthodox rabbi in Jerusalem who didn't attack her, who didn't lecture at her, who simply asked her what Bible verses the family was basing this religious belief on, and just getting her to rethink her views. So, and she wrote a wonderful memoir about this. She's done many TED Talks. So that in itself was surprising. But where I really, really, really changed my view was she was doing an interview, Megan Phelps Roper, on a radio program I was listening to. And the host of this program, National Public Radio, referred casually to the Westboro Baptist Church, as I did myself, as a hate group. You hate gays, you hate so-called fags. And Megan interrupted her. And she said, no, we don't, or past tense, we didn't. We were the only people who loved gay people. Notice that our slogan wasn't, we hate fags. It was, God hates fags. We truly believed that they were damned to eternal torment in hell unless they repudiated their sexual orientation. And so we were trying to save them out of love. And I thought, I can still disagree with the views, but I can't say this is a hateful view. It is motivated by love, as you understand, consistent with your religious beliefs. And I love telling that story because it is so humbling about having had exactly the wrong way of describing what was causing actions and speech.
Mm. A matter of communication, understanding, and also clarification. And I love that story. Actually, it's very eye-opening to know, what one word, the power of what one word can really just change an entire perspective on what a view can be. And I kind of want to back up a little bit, I feel like a lot of what we've been touching on is the nitty gritty, and I do have some kind of more philosophical or big picture questions for you, if you don't mind. But do you think, is there a difference between protecting the right to free speech and endorsing the messages of the speech itself?
Absolutely distinct. I'm again that famous statement that's usually attributed to the philosopher Voltaire, but actually was said by his biographer in the early 20th century, Evelyn Beatrice Hall, and paraphrasing his ideas, but she said it more memorably. I may disagree with what you say, but defend to the death your right to say it.
Hmm.
And, but unfortunately, most people have the opposite view. Most people defend freedom of speech for me, but not for thee, not understanding that if they want free speech for me, they have to defend it for thee.
Absolutely. And do you think there are ideas that become more dangerous when suppressed?
Oh, for sure. This is such a common phenomenon that attempts to suppress or actual suppress, because no idea can ever be completely suppressed, even in the most totalitarian regimes. Some brave people or foolhardy people always find a way to communicate, often at great risk and sometimes even losing their lives over it. But so attempts to suppress speech rather than reducing the amount of attention the speech receives inevitably amplify the message, amplify the attention it receives, and the sympathy that it gets. That's such a common phenomenon that we have many terms to describe it. One is called the boomerang effect. Another one is the forbidden fruits effect, right? Every time I hear about a book that's being banned somewhere, I get curious about the book, even if I've never heard of it before. I often end up, reading about it and sometimes even reading it. Another term that's commonly used is the Streisand effect, because quite a few years ago, Barbara Streisand was trying to keep pictures of her Malibu estate off the internet, and most people hadn't heard about her estate, weren't interested, but suddenly there was such a surge of people looking for those pictures precisely because of the attention she created through the sensorial efforts.
Oh, I've never heard of the Streisand, the term Streisand effect, but I love that one. And I think you're right, and it becomes almost this concept of echo chamber, and especially when we talk about our conversation from earlier, we talked about different mediums of civil liberties being violated. So with that being said, do you think social media has changed people's relationship with free speech permanently?
I certainly hope not. We're seeing a panic, what many of us call a moral panic about social media, just as we saw about the internet several decades ago, and as we've seen about every new communications medium throughout history, certainly going back to the printing press, that public attention and the attention of other media focuses on the negative potential and takes for granted the enormous positive potential, incomparable positive potential, including for counter speech against the speech that we dislike. But it's a major struggle. And I think that what we're seeing a pendulum swing where you have support from all across the political spectrum for supposedly protecting children because of assumed harm. And there's a lot of evidence that there can be, there's correlational evidence about extreme exposure to social media and some negative consequences for young people. I take that very, very seriously, but I also take very seriously the critique that comes from very respected social scientists who say this is correlational evidence only, and we should be very, very cautious before jumping to the conclusion that there's a causal connection. It may very well be that the young people who are the most anxious and the most depressed and the most lonely are the ones who are using social media more for that reason, that the causal relationship can go the other way. There are also a lot of evidence, anecdotal and survey, that show that people, especially young people who are isolated and anxious and depressed, are starved for real world contacts. Let's say you're a a gay young person living in an unsupportive family in a part of the country where you don't have folks in the real world that share your questions or your conclusions. You can find and create online communities where you can be welcome. So I just, would urge, rather than what I think is pretty much a rush to judgment at this moment, more caution, and more studies and more examination about underlying causes rather than the relatively quick fix of, oh, let's just block social media and then all the problems will be solved. It's a distraction from looking at more deep-rooted and harder to address, but more meaningful underlying causes.
Absolutely, and a preemptive judgment, and also just jumping to conclusions in general. I think being cautious and being wary of when you're kind of feeling and thinking of those things, it's important. And I'm just curious to ask you one more question before I think our fun lightning round. But what's one conversation America desperately needs to have right now, maybe with each other on bigger platforms, or even between organizations like Mountain States and ACLU, or of that kind?
I would say that given that we have this monumental historic landmark of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, I wish that everybody would reread that wonderful document, if not the specific grievances that come toward the end, the general principles at the beginning about what the values and aspirations are of this country. Of course, we never were close to them when those words were penned by slaveholding Thomas Jefferson in 1776. But the fact that the nation was founded in the belief that we should live up to those principles, we should aspire to do so, and then a few years later created a constitution that gives us tools by which we have advanced closer and closer to those ideals. That is really what binds us together as a nation. People, unlike other countries which are founded because of geographical connections or tribal connections or religious connections, what binds us together are these fundamental beliefs that all of us are created equal, and that the purpose of government is to secure our equal rights. Each of us has a full right to participate in that government, to respect the decisions of our fellow citizens when they disagree with us. They're not evil people. They are working like us. We're all flawed. Even Thomas Jefferson, great as he was a flawed human being. And these constitutional ideals and structures should help us to surmount the differences on which we are too much concentrating, and to focus on the really inspiring and lofty ideals that bind us together.
Absolutely. No better time than the anniversary to remind yourself how to stay accountable of both the document, of each other, of the government. And I couldn't have said it better myself. But Nadine, we do have one lightning round before I have a final question for you. But are you open and ready to doing something like that?
Yes, I am.
All right. So, first question. Which historical figure would you most want to have dinner with?
Frederick Douglass.
Hmm. I like that. And then, what's a book that you have or would give as a gift?
John Stuart Mill's On Liberty.
What's one opinion on free speech you've changed your mind about? Or refined your mind about?
Refined my view. Um, I'm so sorry. I'm drawing a blank on that. And that's terrible because I try to be open-minded.
Well, you just have so many, you debate so much. I wouldn't be
Okay,
surprised.
let me hear, since you said First Amendment, I won't give a specific decision, but I'll say decisions about the non-establishment clause in the First Amendment. I think in the past I have been insufficiently sensitive to concerns on the part of religious people, that they believe that the non-establishment clause can be enforced to remove religion from the public square. I have not been persuaded, but I'm willing to re-examine that with more sympathy toward their perspective.
What is the best advice you ever received?
Was from my predecessor as ACLU president, Norman Dorson, who was a professor at NYU Law School. And I was trying to decide whether to accept a particular job offer. And it wasn't something that I really wanted to do, but I thought it might ultimately lead to something I wanted to do. And he said, just take one step at a time. Don't do what makes sense for you now. Do you want this particular job now or not? And don't try to forecast where it could lead potentially.
And then when people look back on your career 50 years from now, what do you hope they remember?
I hope they remember somebody who tried as hard as a flawed human being can to be staunchly neutral in defending all fundamental freedoms for all people, not just people like me, not just people I like, not just ideas I like. And that I hope that I had some impact in persuading others to adopt that neutral stance.
Wow. And I do believe after reading so much awesome things about you and hearing all of the cases that you've gotten to touch and handle, I believe all of that is very true, and I think people will be able to look back and say, "Wow, she did her best," and we're all just humans trying to do our best. So, with that, my one final question to you is: feel free to let the people. It's not so much a question; it's more of a statement per se. But feel free to let the people know what you have going on and anything you want people to know about and how they can see more of your work.
Well, I have written several books in the last couple of years. I mentioned the one that I think would be the most useful and user-friendly for most people. It's really quite short, and it is called, again, The War on Words: 10 Arguments Against Free Speech and Why They Fail. And I must say, Noah, that I and my co-author tried very, very hard to come up with what we thought were the strongest arguments. We weren't giving ourselves softballs, and we also tried our level best to be open-minded. Are those arguments correct? And we continued to persuade ourselves, but after very hard and rigorous thinking, that no, they're not. It's a very quick read. I know people have short attention spans these days, but I hope that they would find this book worth their time.
I'm definitely gonna have to get myself a copy, and I'm excited to dive more into it. I know the First Amendment is one of my fortes. I love diving into it. I do love all the amendments, not to say I don't, but First Amendment has definitely perked my ears in recent years. But thank you so much, Nadine. If you, our audience, enjoyed this conversation, make sure to subscribe and follow Beyond the Bench wherever you get your podcasts and visit mslegal.org to learn more about how you can stand with us in defending the Constitution. My name is Noah DeSicow, joined by Nadine Strossen, and we will see you next time to go Beyond the Bench.
Thank you so much, Noah, and thanks to the audience members.